So here we are.
Okay, Mitch Abidor. I believe there have been several generations of Abidors living in Brooklyn.
Right. It's funny because I've been saying for years that I was third generation, and then I realized that I actually have a whole lot of great grandparents, not just like one set. And so I'm fourth generation Brooklyn, because my all of my family immigrated on both sides. They were from England, Romania, and two from Russia. And all of my grandparents came over with their parents. Thus, I'm fourth generation. And all of them settled. That the only one I know for sure where they started was the Abidors started in what's now East Harlem, which at the time was the second biggest Jewish neighborhood in America, thus in the world. But they came over, the Abidors, on the St. Louis, which would later be famous as the Ship of the Damned. The ship that was full of immigrants from Europe who ended up going from port to port in the late 1930s to flee Germany, and nobody would take them in. And the ship had to go back to Europe, and most of the people who were on the ship ended up dying in the camps. And I've always said that had the American government known at Ellis Island that the Abidors were on the St. Louis, they would have turned back that ship in 1909 also. But just to give an idea, when I say bad things about the Abidors, and we have a beautiful name and we don't quite live up to it. Abidor is Hebrew, means father of the generation. As near as I can tell, every Abidor in the world is related to me. They're all from Odessa, which is where my grandfather's from. But as a sign of what the Abidors are like, in particular, my family, my grandfather and his two brothers, who came over, my grandfather came over a year after his two older brothers, is the biblical epic, The Robe, which I don't know if it's made it to Oz, but it's always shown every year around Easter. It's the Romans, it's Jesus. And if you just Google Abidor, what comes up is the actor Leon Askin in the role of Abidor in The Robe. And so I just assumed, when I would see it, there was some mistake, or it's not a biblical name, but somebody just wanted to use a Hebrew sounding name. And then I looked. It's based on a novel, the film, by Lloyd C. Douglas, the novel, big bestseller. And I found it online, and I searched for the name Abidor to see where it showed up in the novel. And it doesn't. There is no Abidor in the novel. Abidor only appears in the film. And Abidor in the film is an absolute backstabbing, worthless prick. That he rats out the Christians to the Romans. He rats out the Romans to the Christians. He's just an awful, horrible person. So I said, he has to be a relative of mine. And when I did research, wasn't difficult to do. The screenplay was written by Albert Maltz. Albert Maltz, who was one of the Hollywood 10, a communist who was blacklisted. Albert Maltz, it turns out, is from he and his family are from the same neighborhood in Brooklyn as the Abidors, Brownsville. I did a little bit more research, and my grandfather and his two brothers were house painters. Albert Maltz's family was house painters in the same neighborhood. And then we did further research, and Abidor has a very small role in the film. And at the end, he even pisses off the Romans. Richard Burton says, Abidor, go back to Damascus. But he had apparently, in the original screenplay, which is in the Albert Maltz archives, Abidor had a huge role as a traitor and a backstabber, not just like a passing role. So what I did was I wrote to the archivist in charge of the Albert Morse archives and asked him to go through it and see if he can find any mention of somebody in my family. And he went through it. He said, there's nothing there, but your theory that it's based on your grandfather or one of his brothers is almost certainly true. I even found Albert Morse's family and wrote to them. They didn't know anything. So then the question was, who was the prick that was the inspiration for Abidor? My grandfather or one of his two brothers? Now the competition there is stiff because one of my grandfather's brothers abandoned his family and was a real ne'er-do-well, as once would have been said. And if you look him up, it's Joseph Abidor. He was murdered. And my father had always told me that the story was that his uncle was murdered. He was in a bar with a woman. The woman's boyfriend came in and shot my great uncle. But now in the age of the internet, you don't have to trust, the memory of an aging father. And you find stories about it. It's actually a great story. So my great uncle had abandoned his family. He was living in Queens somewhere. And the newspaper talked about, so he had a roommate and he brought what was called in the newspapers his Negro paramour to his apartment. And the inference of the story is that they were having sex and it was really loud. And when his roommate told him, can you guys keep it down? My great uncle totally ignored him. And so his roommate slammed him in the head with an iron and killed my uncle. So he's a very good candidate for being the source for Abidor. But there's also my own grandfather who spent he and my grandmother, who I used to visit religiously every year, they moved to Miami Beach, and they were real typical immigrants with the heavy accents, the whole thing. And they never did anything but fight. It's all they ever did was fight. And it was just awful to be around them because she would say, "Loy, gay essen, go eat." And he would say, "Lady, leave me alone." They would argue in their sleep. It was just awful. And so just before, in 2000 it was my parents' 50th anniversary, and my father died within a couple of weeks of that. And so we had a big celebration. And I was sitting with two people from my father's generation, his sister-in-law and his cousin. And I was talking about how my grandparents were always fighting. And so my aunt said to me, "Well, and my father's cousin said, "Well," I said, "Wait, I'm like 50 years old. You could tell me like whatever this is." So it turns out, not everybody might think that my grandpa was a prick for doing this, but my grandpa was not only a house painter, but he owned property all over Jewish Brooklyn. And, you go, there's a woman in an apartment. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? They offer, you take. So my grandma found out that my grandpa was cheating on her. She was going to throw him out. And her sisters, who were terrific women, said to her, "Rose, what are you, crazy? He's got money. He's got property. What, you going to throw him out? What you do is you stay with him forever and you make his life a living hell." And that's just what happened.
That's fantastic.
For the next, I don't know how many decades, all they ever did was fight.
Yeah.
So my guess, so it could have been, any of the three brothers, but the two likely candidates were his brother Joe and my grandpa. So, there is the Abidor place in cinema history and cinema immortality. The rest of the family I mean, I don't know how it is, with you, Andy, but I'm sure that most people, you're much more interested in the family whose name you bear
Mm,
than the other ones.
mm.
So even though I'm every bit as related to my mother's family, the Brasses, I don't feel any particular connection to them, even though, I carry the same amount of DNA as an Abidor. Uh, but anyway, so the whole family was in Brooklyn, and they all lived in Brownsville. My mother told me that she came from a huge family. I mean, not to her direct family, she had three brothers, but my maternal grandfather had, I didn't never really knew them, but he had something like 7 or 8 brothers. So they all had, when you think of all the family that's involved in that. So my mother always told me that she was related to Lauren Bacall, and she did look like Lauren Bacall, and also General Mickey Marcus, one of the first generals of the Israeli army. But to about like living in Brooklyn, I've lived in, all of my permanent addresses have been in Brooklyn, and with the beauty of modern life, on Google, I mapped all my addresses, and in my entire pathetic existence, I've traveled 9 miles. That's it. So
Physically 9 miles, mentally
right,
and culturally a lot further. But we
right,
shall see. We shall see.
right. But the thing with that is, when I bought the house that I live in, that you can see in the background here, at least the bookshelves,
Mm.
and I went for the closing to sign the contract and the whole thing, and I saw that it was the same zip code that I grew up in, and it was the most depressing moment of my life to realize, my whole, if I were to be buried instead of cremated, my tombstone could just say Mitchell Abidor, 1952 to whatever year, and my whole epitaph would just be 11234, because that's pretty much it. There it is. My whole life. What it is, it's funny, last week, I don't know how I never thought of this, that I thought of like the through line of my life, and it's Louis Buñuel's The Exterminating Angel, where all the guests are in this fancy room and they want to get out, and they never do. There's something that prevents them from ever getting past the doorway. And my life, I grew up in the part of Brooklyn that I live in now. I hated it when I was young. I hate it now, and yet I can't get out. And as I told a bunch of, my wife and a friend yesterday, oh, they say, oh, you could move. You got to move. I said, feet first. The only way I'm leaving this part of Brooklyn is feet first. And there are moments where I think that can't come soon enough. So
I think that's the reality, really. However much we think we move, we live in the same world, and
uh-huh.
it's just as well to be in 11234
Yep.
as anywhere else. So 11234, they got a good primary school for a young Jewish kid.
Well, it's good that you threw in the word Jewish there, because it was I loved my elementary school years were great. The elementary, the school I went to, PS 203, the Floyd Bennett School. Floyd Bennett was a test pilot. There's an airfield still down at the end of Flatbush Avenue, Floyd Bennett Field. And so I went to PS 203. I mean, I only went to 3 schools. PS 203, we didn't move. So, when we moved out of Brownsville, we moved to Flatlands in the southern end of Brooklyn. So my whole childhood was all in one address with the PS 203. And it was a different era in so many ways. And what it is there was no disguising. Uh, like now, class numbers don't mean anything. You don't want to let anybody think they're smarter than anybody else or stupider than anybody else. But in the 1950s and 60s, they didn't respect those niceties. Every class had a number. You were in class 1-1, 1-2, 1-3, 1-4, and the higher the second number was, the dumber the class. So I was always in, of course, class 1-2, or class, School was so smart that you could be the third class, which would have been 90 kids, even more, because usually it was between 30 and 36 kids in a class. And, I was a smart kid, and I was in class like 3. So the way that they got around making us think we weren't, less intelligent than class 1 was each class had a specialty. So class say 4-1, you were 4th grader, but class 1 played string instruments. Class 2 played wind instruments, and class 3 was the chorus. But, when you said about being, a nice Jewish boy, I didn't even know any non-Jews. Because, I have to be honest, the non-Jews were in class 5, 6, 7, and 8. And the Jews, classes 1, 2, and 3, were all Tannenbaum, Abidor, Steinberg, Dubner. So, that was what it was. I absolutely, think about it. I didn't step foot in a non-Jew's house until I think I was 18. And since, my grandparents had the heavy Yiddish accent, couldn't even imagine that there were grandparents who spoke English with no accent, because it just did not compute. Grandparents were immigrants. There was no way around it. So that's why I do such a good accent, because I was around them all the time. And then, but also another way that the schools just didn't disguise who was smarter than everybody else was in junior high school. There was a special accelerated program where you would do the 7th grade, skip the 8th grade, go to the 9th grade, all in junior high. And there too, Futterman, Cohen, everybody, everybody was Jewish, everybody. But there was a little bit, difficult for me, because I had always been the smartest kid in the class. And there were smart kids, but I was much the smartest. Then I got into junior high school, and I was with all these kids who were the stars of all their classes from a number of elementary schools. And my ego took a huge hammering that took many years to recover from. But everything, that if I would have grabbed my high school yearbook, which I still have, right over here, I went to James Madison High School, which you might think should be nothing to somebody in Melbourne, except Bernie Sanders went to James Madison High School. Ruth Bader Ginsburg went to James Madison High School. Chuck Schumer was 2 years ahead of me at James Madison High School. And in fact, at one point, 3% of the US Senate graduated from my high school. Schumer, Bernie Sanders, and Norm Coleman, who was a Republican from Minnesota, who was defeated by Al Franken, but he grew up just blocks away from where I now live. But again, if I go through the yearbook, you would think that I went to high school in Tel Aviv, and which is a sign of a whole bunch of things. Among them, just how segregated New York was, and probably always will be. That my neighborhood, that my block, there were 30 some odd houses on my block, and there was one non-Jewish family. And how they got there and how they survived is beyond me. But yeah, so that's growing up and going to school.
What was it like for you in the playground? How did you get on?
What you say is, it's a constant topic of discussion, and if you go to Brooklyn from the 1950s websites, we didn't go to the playground, or very seldom. Didn't have to. We played on the streets. You don't see it at all anymore. I'm not gonna go into kids with video games and all that. But we all played games. We played stickball. There were 3 different varieties of stickball, and we played punch ball, and we played roller hockey, and we played ringalivio, and we played hide and seek. And it was all broken down by age groups. And it's like it's actually in a way really comical because my age group, everybody was born in 1951, 2, and 3. If you were born in 1950, you were too old to play with us. If you were born in 1954, you were too young to play with us. So my brother, who's 2 years younger than me, never played with us. But there was also priority. So the big kids, as we call them, who were all born a year before, 2 years before me, say 1950, they would play street games on the choice part of the block. Because games were played, there was manhole covers. You might have, you must have them there also. But that was uh, manhole covers were sewers, and that was how everything was counted. So if you hit the ball, if you hit it 2 sewers, it was worth more than hitting it, and they were 30 yards apart. It's funny, the junk I remember, the sewers were 30 years apart. I don't know what my father's birthday was. I don't know what year my mother died, but I know the sewers are 30 yards apart. So the big kids had the choice sewers down here. We had like the middle group of sewers, and the younger kids were like all the way down at the end of the block, the most undesirable part of the block to play. But we
In
never
the in the playground, were they all Jewish kids as well?
well we never went to the playground.
When I
Only
say
this
playground, I
right
mean
on
the
the
street. In the
right
street.
on only because the whole block was Jewish. So everybody would play, but the games that we played, and this is what I think is, I discuss this with people all the time. Joan, my wife, who grew up in St. Louis on a really nice cul-de-sac in a nice neighborhood, and who comes from a civilized parents, not a bunch of tumblers like my family and everybody on my block. There was one family on the block uh, that was college, with one father on the block was college educated out of 30 some odd. That's it. The rest of the block was truck drivers, taxi drivers. My father was a civil servant who uh, only had a high school diploma. My mother was a high school dropout. And so yeah, so everybody was Jewish. Nobody was particularly educated, but we played the same exact games as my father's generation. And then all these games, so if you look at pictures of New York in the 1930s, they're playing stickball and they're playing stoop ball and all the stuff that we played. And then we played them. And then even though we tried to get our kids to play them, but by the time we had kids, nobody was playing on the street anymore. But yes, everybody was Jewish, which led to, we all loved, well, kind of, the great Jewish athletes. So the great pitcher in the early 1960s was Sandy Koufax, who was actually a Jew from Brooklyn. And everybody worshiped Sandy Koufax because he refused to pitch on, I think it was Yom Kippur. His team was playing in the World Series, and he refused to pitch, and he became like as close to the Messiah. If we had to choose between Jesus and Sandy Koufax, it wasn't even close. Wasn't even close. But
Did you watch any movies in those days?
oh yeah, we went every weekend. There were 3 movie theaters. There were 2 movie theaters right near us. As a matter of fact, I live really close to where they are, and they usually showed all these like Roman gladiator type films. So there was a Hannibal, and there was Steve Reeves as Hercules, and that was what we went to. Or they showed Godzilla, all the Godzilla films, but we were not. Whereas now I'm a real shusher, and I much prefer at this point watching films at home because I don't have to worry about anybody talking. Nobody's blocking my view. When we went to the movies, it was just part of a whole thing. We would all go, we'd all of us go, and we would throw, popcorn boxes at the screen, and we would like shout stuff at the screen. But we went to movies every weekend, every weekend. We would walk there as a group because this was also, we actually walked, me and my friends, we all went to the same schools. We would walk to school unaccompanied, and it was like 8 blocks. walk home at lunchtime, go back after lunch, come back at the end of the day. We would walk to the movie theater unless it was really far away. And oh yeah, so movies were like that was we would have to go to shul, have to go to synagogue on Saturday mornings, but we couldn't get out of it soon enough so that we could go to see what Steve Reeves is up to, or Victor Mature, or whoever.
And what about books? Did you read at an early age?
I did actually. Uh, I really love to read. And when I was way too young for it, there was some offer in some magazine, and it was 5 books for I don't remember what it was, but I told my parents, oh, I want these. And I remember some of the books. There was The Hunchback of Notre Dame. At the time, I would not have said Notre Dame. There was Last of the Mohicans, and I forget which of them, but I was only like 6 years old. So these books were, it was kind of like, as soon as I learned like the basics of a language, I buy novels in it thinking, well, I'll be able to read them, and it doesn't quite work out. But I still have in the basement here the first book that I bought myself, because there used to be, and I look forward to this, and you'd ask about books. They used to have book fairs. I don't know if they had them in Australia. And you'd have a book fair, and also there was something called the Arrow Book Club, and you could order books. But we had a book fair when I must have been 8 or 9 years old, and I was already, it's just 1960, and I was already a Civil War buff. And I still have downstairs a copy of The Red Badge of Courage and Other Stories by Stephen Crane. It had like a Civil War soldier on the cover, and that's all I needed. I was just in heaven. And I didn't read it then. I don't think I've ever gotten around to reading it. Now I'd be afraid to open it because it's really followed me my entire life. But I love books. And there was even, I think it was in 3rd or 4th grade, a contest, like who would read the most books. And I won it hands down, partially by cheating, because a book is a book. And there used to be, I would send away, because, like every kid, I get upset that I didn't get any mail. And some insurance company, I don't know if it was Prudential, John Hancock, they had pamphlets, biographies of great Americans. And they were like 10 pages long, maybe 20. I ordered every one of them and read them all. And so I artificially inflated my count of books. I still keep track of how many books that I read. And in an average year, up until this year, when I lost most of my eyesight, or last year, I read 250 books a year and saw 150 films a year. But now I can't, because my eyes had strokes. I didn't have stroke. My eyes had stroke, and I lost 50% of the vision in both eyes. Reading is a struggle, and I can watch films as long as they're not subtitled. So last year I only read 150 books, but I saw 300 films. So that's like something else that's like followed me my entire life. I love films, was a good question, and I love books.
And so, were you reading in English? When were you first reading books in French or something?
Not till 1979.